somewhere in the dry zone of central Myanmar, in a landscape of scrubby thorn trees and yellowed grass, there is a city that once held more people than London would contain for another 1,000 years. Its walls enclosed an area of roughly 14 square kilometers, larger than ancient Rome within its Servian walls. It had a system of irrigation canals that turned the arid plain into productive farmland. It cremated its dead in a manner consistent with Theravada Buddhist practice, centuries before that tradition became dominant in mainland Southeast Asia. It minted silver coins stamped with symbols of kingship and cosmic order, and it left behind burial urns, brick monasteries, and gold artifacts of such refinement that the craftsmen who produced them must have trained for decades to achieve that level of skill. The city was called Sri Kshetra. Almost no one alive today has heard its name. Sri Kshetra was not alone. It was one of several major urban centres belonging to a people known as the PU, who built what may be the earliest complex civilization in the region we now call Myanmar. The PU city-states flourished for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 9th century of the Common Era. They occupied the river valleys of the Irrawaddy and its tributaries, building walled cities with sophisticated hydraulic infrastructure, practicing Buddhism at a time when much of Southeast Asia was still following animist or Hindu traditions, and engaging in long-distance trade that connected them to India, China, and the maritime networks of the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea. 1,000 years. Let that number settle. The Roman Republican Empire, from the traditional founding date to the fall of the western half, lasted roughly 1,000 years. The Pew civilization endured for a comparable span. 1,000 years is 40 human generations. It is long enough for a language to evolve beyond recognition, for a forest to grow and die and grow again, for the bed of a river to shift kilometers from its original course. The PU did not merely exist for this period. They built, traded, worshipped, irrigated, and governed across a millennium of continuous civilizational activity in the heart of mainland Southeast Asia. And yet the PU have been almost entirely erased from the way we understand the ancient world. They do not appear in world history textbooks. They are absent from documentary about ancient civilizations. They are unknown to the general public in every country except Myanmar itself. And even there, their story is often overshadowed by the later kingdoms of Bagan, Agava, and Mandalay. The civilization that laid the cultural, religious, and hydraulic foundations upon which all subsequent Burmese states were built has been rendered invisible by the passage of time and the indifference of scholarship. Something is wrong with our assumptions about where civilization flourished in the ancient world. We speak of India and China as the great civilizations of Asia. We acknowledge the Khmer Empire, the kingdoms of Java, the trading states of the Malay world. But we rarely mention the civilization that sat between India and China in the river valleys of Myanmar, absorbing influences from both and producing something that was neither Indian nor Chinese but distinctly its own. The PU city-states were not peripheral outposts of Indian civilization. They were not satellite communities of the Chinese Empire. They were an independent civilizational tradition that developed its own script, its own architectural forms, its own religious practices, and its own political organization over the course of a millennium. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what the PRU built and why it matters. You are going to see how a network of walled cities in the dry zone of Myanmar became one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in ancient Southeast Asia. You are going to learn how their religious practices, their hydraulic engineering, and their artistic traditions shaped the cultures that came after them. And you are going to confront a question that should unsettle anyone who cares about how we remember the human past. How does a civilization that lasted 1,000 years, that built cities larger than their European contemporaries, that produced art and architecture of extraordinary beauty, simply disappear from the record of human achievement? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. These questions matter. They matter not just for the people of Myanmar, but for everyone who believes that the history of humanity belongs to all of humanity, not just to the civilizations that happen to produce the textbooks. The PRU city-states are proof that Southeast Asia was not a passive recipient of Indian and Chinese culture, but a site of independent civilizational achievement. Their erasure from the historical record impoverishes our understanding of the ancient world and perpetuates a distorted vision of which peoples and which places have contributed to the human story. The answers lie buried in the soil of the Irrawaddy Valley, in the brick foundations of monasteries that have not seen a living monk for over 1,000 years, in the burial urns that hold the ashes of people whose names we will never know. The answers are there. They have always been there. We simply stopped looking now. Let us begin. The Irrawaddy River is the spine of Myanmar. It rises in the glaciers of the eastern Himalayas, flows southward for over 2,100 kilometers through the heart of the country, and empties into the Andaman Sea through a vast, fertile delta. Along its course, the Irrawaddy passes through a region known as the Dry Zone, a corridor of relatively low rainfall that runs through central Myanmar between the wetter highlands to the west and east. The Dry Zone receives between 500 and 1,000 millimeters of rain per year, concentrated in the monsoon season. It is not a desert, but it is dry enough that successful agriculture requires careful water management. Rivers, streams, and seasonal tributaries must be channeled, dammed, and distributed through networks of canals and reservoirs to sustain the rice cultivation that feeds large populations. The Dry Zone of Myanmar is not merely a geographic feature. It is a crucible, a place where the challenges of water scarcity forced human communities to develop sophisticated strategies for survival and, eventually, for prosperity. The monsoon rains, when they come, arrive with tremendous force, drenching the landscape for several months before retreating and leaving the land to dry under the intense tropical sun. This seasonal rhythm dominates life in the Dry Zone. Agriculture must be timed to the rains. Water must be stored during the wet season for use during the dry months. And the rivers, which swell to enormous volumes during the monsoon and shrink to modest streams during the dry season, must be managed to prevent both flooding and drought. The engineering challenge of managing water in this environment should not be underestimated. It requires not only physical infrastructure, canals, dams, reservoirs, and weirs, but also social infrastructure, systems of governance that can coordinate the labor needed to build and maintain hydraulic works, allocate water rights among competing users, and resolve the disputes that inevitably arise when a critical resource is scarce. The PU met this challenge. They built hydraulic systems of sufficient sophistication to sustain large urban populations for centuries. This achievement alone would place them among the significant civilizations of the ancient world, even without their other accomplishments in art, religion, and urban planning. It was in this dry zone along the Irrawaddy and its tributaries that the PU built their cities. The choice of location was not accidental. The river valleys provided water for irrigation, alluvial soils for agriculture, and natural transportation corridors for trade. The Dry Zone's relatively open landscape, compared to the dense forests of the surrounding highlands, facilitated communication between settlements. And the position of the Dry Zone, roughly midway between the Indian subcontinent to the west and the Chinese Empire to the north and east, placed the PU at a natural crossroads of overland and riverine trade routes. The earliest evidence of PU settlement dates to roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era, though the chronology of the earliest phases remains imprecise. The PU language, which is known from a small number of inscriptions, belongs to the Tibeto-Burman language family, linking the PU linguistically to the broader family of peoples who inhabit the highlands of mainland Southeast Asia and southern China. The exact origins of the PU are debated. Some scholars have proposed that they migrated southward from the Tibetan Plateau or the Yunnan region of China, following the river valleys into the lowlands of Myanmar. Others have argued for a more complex model in which the PRU identity emerged through a process of cultural consolidation among communities already resident in the Irrawaddy Valley. The archaeological evidence is not yet sufficient to resolve this question definitively. The question of PU origins is complicated by the limited evidence available. The PU language, known from inscriptions, has been classified as a member of the Tibeto-Burman family, but its precise position within that family is debated. Some linguists have placed it close to the Burmese branch, while others have argued for a more distant relationship. The PU script, derived from an Indian model, provides clues about the cultural connections of the PU, but tells us little about their ethnic origins. And the archaeological evidence, while it shows a clear development of urban culture in the Irrawaddy Valley from the early centuries of the Common Era onward, does not conclusively identify the ethnic identity of the earliest urban populations. What we can say is that the PU civilization emerged from a process of interaction between local communities and external influences. The Indian influence is visible in the adoption of Buddhism, the use of an Indian-derived script, and the incorporation of Indian artistic and architectural motifs. The Chinese influence is visible in trade goods and in the diplomatic relationships recorded in Chinese historical sources. But the core of PU civilization, the urban planning, the hydraulic engineering, the burial practices, and the particular synthesis of Buddhist and local traditions, was a local achievement developed by people who lived in the Irrawaddy Valley and adapted to its specific conditions. What is clear is that by the early centuries of the Common Era, the PU had established a network of walled urban centres in the dry zone that represent the earliest known cities in the territory of modern Myanmar. The three most important of these cities, and the three that have received the most archaeological attention, are Baekthano, Halin, and Sri Kshetra. Together, these three sites, along with their surrounding landscapes, were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014 under the title PU Ancient Cities, a recognition that acknowledged their significance as evidence of the earliest urban civilization in Myanmar. Baekthano, located in the Magwi region of central Myanmar, is the earliest of the three major PU cities. Archaeological evidence suggests that Baekthano was occupied from roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. The city was enclosed by a wall roughly 320 hectares in area, a substantial enclosure that suggests a population of considerable size. Within the walls, excavations conducted by the Myanmar Department of Archaeology and by international teams have revealed the remains of brick structures, including what appear to be Buddhist monasteries and stupa foundations, as well as residential areas, workshops, and burial sites. The burial practices at Baekthano are among the most informative sources of evidence for early PU culture. The PU practiced cremation, and the ashes of the deceased were placed in ceramic urns that were then buried in designated areas within or near the city walls. This practice is significant because it is consistent with Buddhist funerary traditions, suggesting that Buddhism was already established among the Pyu at a remarkably early date. The cremation urns themselves are often finely made, with decorative elements that include stamped or incised designs. Some burials include grave goods such as beads, bronze objects, and small gold ornaments, indicating social differentiation within the Pyu community. The beads found in PU burial contexts are themselves a rich source of information about trade and cultural connections. Glass beads, etched carnelian beads, and agate beads have all been recovered from PU sites. Some of these beads show strong similarities to beads produced in India and in other parts of Southeast Asia, suggesting participation in a broad regional exchange network. The etched carnelian beads are particularly significant because they represent a specialized craft technology that originated in the Indus Valley civilization and spread across South and Southeast Asia over millennia. The presence of these beads at PIU sites provides tangible evidence of the trade connections that linked the Irrawaddy Valley to the broader Indian Ocean world. The ceramic traditions of the PU also reveal a society with sophisticated craft production. PU pottery includes both utilitarian wares, plain jars and bowls used for cooking and storage, and finely made vessels with decorative elements that suggest production by specialist potters. Some PU ceramics show similarities to pottery traditions in India and in other parts of Southeast Asia, while others are distinctly local in character. The combination of imported influences and local innovation in the ceramic record mirrors the broader pattern of cultural synthesis that characterizes PU civilization as a whole. Helene, located further north in the Shuebo district of Sagaing region, is another major PU city that has yielded important archaeological evidence. Helene's city walls enclose an area of roughly 600 hectares, nearly twice the size of Baekthano. The walls themselves are substantial, constructed of brick with an earthen core, and in some places they still stand to a height of several meters. The layout of Helene includes evidence of a planned urban structure, with streets, water management features, and designated areas for religious and residential use. Excavations at Helene have revealed brick monastery remains, stupa foundations, and extensive evidence of metalworking, including iron smelting. The ironworking evidence at Helene is particularly significant because it suggests that the PIU had developed sophisticated metallurgical capabilities. Iron tools and weapons were essential for agriculture, construction, and warfare in the ancient world, and the ability to smelt and work iron was a mark of technological achievement. The iron production at Helene appears to have been substantial, with slag deposits indicating sustained, large-scale smelting activity over extended periods. The urban landscape of Helene has been further illuminated by the work of the Myanmar Department of Archaeology and international collaborators, who have used magnetometry and other non-invasive survey techniques to map subsurface features without the need for excavation. These surveys have revealed the outlines of structures, streets, and water management features that are not visible on the surface, suggesting that the below-ground archaeological record at Helene is far richer than the surface remains alone would indicate. The potential for future discovery at Helene is enormous, but the resources available for research at the site remain limited. The chronological relationship between the three major PRU cities is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. Baekthano appears to be the earliest, with occupation beginning in the 2nd century before the Common Era, or possibly earlier. Helene may have been occupied during a period that overlaps with both Baekthano and Sri Kshetra. Sri Kshetra appears to have been the dominant PU city during the later period, from roughly the 5th to the 9th century of the Common Era. Some scholars have proposed that political power shifted from Baekthano to Helene to Sri Kshetra over time, a northward to southward migration of the political centre that mirrors similar patterns in other ancient civilizations. But the evidence is insufficient to confirm or refute this hypothesis with certainty, and it is possible that multiple PIU cities coexisted as independent or semi-independent political entities throughout much of the PIU period. But it is Sri Kshetra, the largest and most impressive of the PU cities, that most fully reveals the scale and sophistication of PU civilization. Sri Kshetra, located near the modern town of Phai in the Bargo region of Myanmar, was the capital of the PIU during the later period of their civilization, roughly from the 5th to the 9th century of the Common Era. Its city walls enclose an area of approximately 14 square kilometers, making it one of the largest walled cities in the ancient world. To put this in perspective, the walled area of Sri Kshetra is larger than the area enclosed by the Aurelian walls of Rome, which were built in the 3rd century of the Common Era to protect a city that was then the capital of the most powerful empire in the Western world. The internal organization of Sri Kshetra, as revealed by archaeological survey and excavation, suggests a city that was divided into functional zones. The religious structures, stupas and monasteries, are concentrated in certain areas, while other zones appear to have been used for residential and possibly commercial purposes. The presence of what appear to be water tanks and reservoirs within the city walls indicates that the PIU planned for the water needs of their urban population, providing sources of water within the city itself, rather than relying entirely on external water sources. The sophistication of this urban planning challenges any assumption that the PU cities were merely large villages. They were planned urban environments, designed and constructed with an understanding of the needs of a complex urban society. The city walls of Sri Kshetra are themselves a significant engineering achievement. Constructed of brick with an earthen core, they were substantial enough to have survived in visible form for over a millennium. The walls served multiple functions. They provided defense against military attack. They defined the legal and administrative boundaries of the city. They controlled access to the city, channeling entry and exit through gates that could be monitored and taxed. And they made a statement about the power and resources of the state that built them. A city that could afford to build 14 kilometers of brick walls was a city that commanded significant wealth and labor. The scale of Sri Kshetra demands attention. 14 square kilometers is not a village, it is not a town. It is a major urban center, the kind of city that requires sophisticated systems of governance, food supply, water management, and social organization to function. The walls of Sri Kshetra, constructed of brick and still partially visible today, extend for roughly 14 kilometers in circumference. Building these walls alone would have required the manufacture of millions of bricks, the mobilization of a large labor force, and the logistical capacity to sustain that labor force over the years or decades required for construction. Within the walls of Sri Kshetra, the archaeological remains tell a story of a city that was both prosperous and cosmopolitan. The most prominent surviving structures are the Buddhist stupas and monastery foundations that dot the landscape. The Borborgi stupa, which still stands to a height of roughly 46 meters, is one of the oldest surviving Buddhist structures in Myanmar, and possibly in all of mainland Southeast Asia. Its cylindrical form, different from the bell-shaped stupas that became standard in later Burmese architecture, represents an early phase in the development of the Buddhist stupa tradition in the region. The Borborgi stupa is a monument that repays careful attention. Its form is cylindrical, tapering slightly toward the top, with a hemispherical dome and a spire that has been damaged by time and weather. The structure is built entirely of brick, with walls of considerable thickness that have allowed it to stand for over 14 centuries. The brickwork is of high quality, with the individual bricks carefully shaped and laid in regular courses that demonstrate a thorough understanding of structural engineering. The mortar used to bind the bricks has been the subject of analytical study, and the results suggest that the PU used a lime-based mortar that was chemically similar to mortars used in Indian and Roman construction. The ability to produce and use lime mortar is itself a marker of technological sophistication, requiring knowledge of calcination, the process of heating limestone to produce quicklime, and of the chemistry of morite setting. Other stupas at Sri Kshetra, including the Pyogi and Pyama, display variations in form that suggest a period of architectural experimentation, a time when PU builders were working out their own interpretations of Buddhist sacred architecture rather than simply copying Indian models. The religious landscape of Sri Kshetra was not exclusively Buddhist. Evidence of Hindu religious practice has also been found at the site, including Vishnu figures and Shiva lingas. This coexistence of Buddhist and Hindu traditions is characteristic of early Southeast Asian civilization more broadly, and it reflects the multiple channels through which Indian religious traditions reached the PU. Trade, missionary activity, and the movement of Brahmin priests and Buddhist monks all contributed to the transmission of Indian religious ideas to mainland Southeast Asia, and the PU absorbed these ideas selectively, adapting them to local conditions and combining them with indigenous spiritual practices. The coins of the PU provide another window into the economic and symbolic life of the city-states. PRU silver coins, typically small and flat, bear images that include the rising sun, the Srivatsa symbol, which is an auspicious mark associated with both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and the Nandipada, a stylized footprint of the bull associated with Hindu deities. The use of coined money implies a level of economic organization that goes beyond simple barter. It suggests markets, trade, taxation, and an administrative apparatus capable of regulating the money supply. The trade connections of the PU extended in multiple directions. To the west, the PU were connected to India through overland routes that crossed the mountain passes between the Irrawaddy Valley and the Indian subcontinent, and through maritime routes that linked the coast of Myanmar to the ports of the Bay of Bengal. To the north and east, the PU were connected to China through overland routes that passed through the highlands of Yunnan. To the south, they were connected to the maritime trading world of Southeast Asia through the rivers and coasts that led to the Andaman Sea and the Straits of Malacca. The evidence for these trade connections comes from archaeological finds of imported goods at PIU sites. Indian beads, both of glass and of semi-precious stone, have been found at Baekthantano, Halin, and Sri Kasetra. Chinese ceramics have been identified in PU archaeological contexts, and PU artifacts, including coins and beads, have been found at sites outside the Irrawaddy Valley, suggesting that the PU were not merely receivers of trade but active participants in it. The tin and bronze objects found at PRU sites may indicate access to tin sources in what is now Thailand or Malaysia, further evidence of the long-distance trade connections that the PRU maintained. The gold artifacts found at PU sites deserve particular attention. Gold finger rings, earrings, and small ornamental objects have been recovered from burial contexts at several PU sites. The quality of the gold work is high, indicating skilled craftsmanship and access to gold supplies. Some of the gold objects show stylistic similarities to Indian goldwork, suggesting either imported objects or the influence of Indian metalworking techniques on PU craftsmen. The presence of gold in burial contexts indicates that it was a prestige material associated with high social status and used to mark the distinction between ordinary and elite members of PU society. The math is striking when we consider what the PU achieved in comparison to their contemporaries. During the period from roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 9th century of the Common Era, the PU built walled cities that were among the largest in Southeast Asia. They developed irrigation systems that transformed the dry zone of central Myanmar into productive agricultural land. They produced metalwork in iron, bronze, silver, and gold. They practiced Buddhism and Hindu traditions simultaneously. They developed their own script, and they maintained trade connections that linked them to India, China, and the maritime world of Southeast Asia. The PYU script itself is a significant cultural achievement. It is derived from an Indian script, probably a southern Indian Brahmi variant, and was adapted to write the PU language, a Tibeto-Burman tongue unrelated to the Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages for which the original Indian scripts were designed. The adaptation of an Indian script to a Tibeto-Burman language was not a simple matter of borrowing letters. It required the creation of new characters, or the modification of existing ones, to represent sounds that did not exist in Indian languages. The development of the PU script represents a creative act of cultural adaptation, a process in which the PU took an Indian tool and reshaped it to serve their own needs. The number of surviving PU inscriptions is small, fewer than 50, and most are fragmentary. The PIU language has been only partially deciphered, largely through the study of a handful of multilingual inscriptions. Most notably the Myazedi inscription, a 12th century text that records the same passage in Pyu Mon, Burmese and Pali. The Myazedi inscription, discovered in the early 20th century near the temples of Bagan, was the key that allowed scholars to begin reading the PU script, much as the Rosetta Stone had allowed the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. But the Myazedi inscription dates from the Bagan period, several centuries after the decline of the PU city-states, and the PU language it records may already have been archaic or modified by the time the inscription was carved. The decipherment of the PU script remains a work in progress. The scholar G.H. Luce, who spent decades studying the languages and inscriptions of Myanmar, made significant contributions to the reading of PYU inscriptions in the mid-20th century. Luce's work, painstaking and meticulous, established the basic framework for reading the PU script and interpreting the language. More recently, scholars including Arlo Griffiths and Mark Miyake have advanced the study of the PU language using comparative linguistic methods and new analytical techniques, but the small corpus of PU texts, the fragmentary condition of many inscriptions, and the limited knowledge of the PU language continue to make the interpretation of individual texts challenging and often uncertain. The difficulty of reading PU inscriptions has a direct impact on our ability to reconstruct PU history. For civilizations with rich textual traditions, like Rome or China, the historical narrative can be built from multiple overlapping sources: chronicles, inscriptions, letters, legal texts, religious writings that provide different perspectives on the same events. For the PIU, the textual record is so thin that even the most basic questions of political history cannot be answered with confidence. How many PIU kingdoms were there? What were the relationships between them? Who were the kings And how are they related to one another? These questions, which can be answered with reasonable precision for many ancient civilizations, remain largely unanswerable for the PU. The limited number of PU inscriptions means that our understanding of PU political history is extremely fragmentary. We do not have a continuous narrative of PU kings, wars, alliances, or political events. We have glimpses, fragments, isolated moments of clarity, surrounded by vast stretches of silence. Chinese historical sources provide some external perspective. The Tang Dynasty histories record a PU embassy to the Chinese court in 802 of the Common Era. The embassy included a troupe of PU musicians and dancers who performed for the Chinese emperor, and the performance is described in considerable detail in the Chinese sources. The music, according to the Chichenese account, used instruments that were different from Chinese instruments, and the melodies were distinctive and unfamiliar. This single note, preserved by chance in the voluminous records of the Chinese Empire, provides a vivid but isolated glimpse of a cultural tradition that has otherwise been entirely lost. And this is where the answer to the question of the PU becomes deeply unsettling. A civilization that endured for a millennium, that built cities larger than Rome, that developed its own script and its own architectural traditions, that maintained international trade connections and diplomatic relations, has been reduced to fewer than 50 fragmentary inscriptions, a handful of archaeological sites, and a scattering of references in foreign sources. The disproportion between the scale of the civilization and the scale of the surviving evidence is staggering. We know that the PU existed, we know that they were sophisticated, we know that they were important, but the details of their history, the names of most of their kings, the substance of their laws, the texture of their daily lives, the stories they told their children, all of this has been lost. The core problem of the PU city-states is not that they were unimportant. The evidence, fragmentary as it is, demonstrates a civilization of considerable scale and sophistication. The core problem is that the PU occupy a position in the geography and chronology of the ancient world that has made them almost uniquely vulnerable to being overlooked. They are too early to be included in the standard narrative of Southeast Asian history, which typically begins with the kingdoms of Angkor, Bagan, and the maritime states of the Malay archipelago. They are too far from the centers of Indian and Chinese civilization to be claimed by the scholarly traditions that study those cultures, and they existed in a country, Myanmar, that has been politically isolated for much of the modern period, making sustained international archaeological research difficult and often impossible. The political dimension of the PU's obscurity deserves emphasis. Myanmar, formerly Burma, was ruled by a military government from 1962 to 2011, with only brief periods of partial openness. During the decades of military rule, international access to archaeological sites was severely restricted. Foreign scholars who wished to study the PU cities faced bureaucratic obstacles, travel restrictions, and the general difficulty of working in a country where the government was suspicious of foreign researchers. The result was that the PU cities received far less international archaeological attention than comparable sites in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, or Indonesia, countries where political conditions were more favorable for international research collaboration. The contrast with the Khmer Empire is instructive. Angkor, the great temple complex of the Khmer civilization in Cambodia, has been the subject of intensive archaeological research since the French colonial period in the 19th century. French scholars mapped, photographed, excavated, and restored the temples of Angkor over the course of decades, producing a vast body of scholarship that made Angkor one of the most well-known archaeological sites in the world. The Angkor Archaeological Park is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site that attracts millions of visitors per year and generates significant revenue for Cambodia's economy. The scholarly and popular attention devoted to Angkor is, by any measure, enormous. The POU cities have received nothing comparable. The first systematic archaeological investigations of the PYU sites were conducted by the Myanmar Department of Archaeology in the mid-20th century, and the results were published primarily in Burmese, a language that few international scholars can read. International research collaborations. while they have increased in recent years, remain limited by the political and logistical challenges of working in Myanmar. The UNESCO World Heritage inscription of the PRU ancient cities in 2014 brought some international visibility to the sites, but the level of scholarly and public attention remains a tiny fraction of what Angkor receives. But here is the problem. The linguistic challenges facing PU studies are also formidable. The PU language, as noted earlier, has been only partially deciphered. Scholars can read many of the individual characters of the PU script thanks to the Myazedi inscription and other multilingual texts, but the grammar and vocabulary of the language remain incompletely understood. Many PU inscriptions contain words and phrases whose meaning is uncertain or unknown. This means that even the inscriptions that have survived cannot be fully exploited as historical sources. They contain information that we can see but cannot read, a frustrating situation that severely limits our ability to reconstruct PU history from internal evidence. The archaeologist Janice Stargart, whose work on the PU city-states represents some of the most important international scholarship on the subject, has described the challenges of PU studies with characteristic frankness. Stargart, who conducted pioneering research at Sri Kshetra and other PYU sites beginning in the 1980s, combined archaeological fieldwork with the analysis of aerial photographs, satellite imagery, and hydraulic engineering to reconstruct the water management systems that sustained the PYU cities. Her work revealed that the PYU had developed elaborate irrigation networks, including canals, reservoirs, and weirs that transformed the dry zone of central Myanmar into a productive agricultural landscape capable of supporting large urban populations. Stargart's research on PU hydraulics is significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that the PU possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge. The design and construction of irrigation systems that can function reliably over decades or centuries requires an understanding of hydrology, soil mechanics, and construction techniques that goes well beyond simple ditch digging. The PYU irrigation works were planned systems designed to capture seasonal rainfall and river water and distribute it across the landscape in a controlled manner. The scale of the PIU hydraulic infrastructure can be appreciated by comparing it to other ancient irrigation systems. The irrigation networks of ancient Mesopotamia, which sustained the cities of Ur, Uruk, and Babylon, are among the best studied examples of ancient hydraulic engineering. The Mesopotamian systems diverted water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers through networks of canals and channels, creating an artificial oasis in an otherwise arid landscape. The PU faced a similar challenge, though, in a different environmental context. The dry zone of Myanmar is not as arid as southern Mesopotamia, but it is dry enough that rain-fed agriculture alone cannot sustain large urban populations. The PYU irrigation systems, like those of Mesopotamia, supplemented natural rainfall with controlled water distribution, extending the productive season and increasing the total area of cultivable land. The comparison with the hydraulic systems of the Khmer Empire at Angkor is also instructive. The Angkor system, which has been extensively studied by scholars including Christophe Potier and Damien Evans, involved enormous reservoirs called barrays, canals, and distribution channels that managed the seasonal monsoon waters and sustained intensive rice cultivation. The scale of the Angkor hydraulic system was greater than that of the PU, reflecting the larger size and greater resources of the Khmer Empire. But the PYU systems were earlier, dating from the first millennium of the Common Era rather than the second, and they may have served as models or precedents for the hydraulic engineering of later Southeast Asian states, including the Burma Kingdom of Bagan. First, it demonstrates that the PIU possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge. The design and construction of irrigation systems that can function reliably over decades or centuries requires an understanding of hydrology, soil mechanics, and construction techniques that goes well beyond simple ditch digging. The PYU irrigation works were planned systems designed to capture seasonal rainfall and river water and distribute it across the landscape in a controlled manner. Second, Stargart's work shows that the PYU cities were not isolated urban centres, but nodes in a larger agricultural landscape that was managed as an integrated system. The city and its hinterland were functionally linked through the irrigation network, with the city providing administrative oversight and the hinterland providing the food surplus that sustained the urban population. This model of urban-rural integration is common in the ancient world. The Mesopotamian city-states were similarly dependent on irrigation networks that linked the city to its agricultural hinterland. The Khmer Empire, centered on Angkor, depended on a vast hydraulic system that managed the seasonal monsoon waters. The PU fit this pattern. They were a hydraulic civilization, one whose urban life was made possible by the management of water resources, and the scale of their hydraulic infrastructure, as revealed by Stargardt's research, suggests a level of social organization and technical capability that is comparable to other major hydraulic civilizations of the ancient world. Stargardt's work also shed light on the relationship between the PU cities and their agricultural hinterlands. Her analysis of the irrigation systems around Sri Ksetra revealed a network of canals that distributed water from the Irrawaddy and its tributaries across a wide area of the dry zone, creating an agricultural zone that was far larger than the walled city itself. The population that depended on this irrigation network was not confined within the city walls. It was dispersed across the landscape, living in villages and hamlets that were functionally linked to the city through the shared infrastructure of the irrigation system. This model of dispersed urbanism is increasingly recognized as a common pattern in the ancient world, particularly in tropical and subtropical environments. The archaeologist Roland Fletcher has argued that many pre-modern cities were what he calls low-density urban complexes, settlements that covered large areas but had relatively low population densities compared to the compact, high-density cities of the Mediterranean world. Angkor is the classic example of this pattern, but the Puryu cities may represent an earlier instance of the same phenomenon. Sri Ksetra's walled area of 14 square kilometers may not have been densely packed with buildings. Instead, it may have enclosed a mixture of built-up areas, gardens, fields, water features, and open spaces, creating an urban environment that was more spacious and more integrated with the surrounding landscape than a European-style city. The implications of this model are significant. If the PU cities were low-density urban complexes, then their populations may have been smaller than the sheer size of their walled enclosures might suggest. A 14 square kilometer enclosure could contain a population of tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, depending on the density of occupation. But even a population of 20 or 30,000, sustained by an irrigation-fed agricultural system and connected to long-distance trade networks, represents a major achievement of social organization. It represents a community that had solved the fundamental challenges of water management, food production, governance, and social coordination that are the prerequisites for urban life. The archaeologist Elizabeth Moore, who has conducted extensive research on the ancient cities of Myanmar, has documented the range and variety of Puryu settlement patterns across the dry zone. Moore's work, which combines field survey with the analysis of satellite imagery, has identified dozens of ancient walled sites in central Myanmar, many of which may be PRU in origin. The number and distribution of these sites suggest that the PU urban network was far more extensive than the three major cities of Baekthano, Helene, and Sri Ksetra alone would indicate. The PIU may have built a system of interconnected urban centres, each with its own walls, its own agricultural hinterland, and its own administrative structure, linked together by trade routes, shared religious traditions, and perhaps political alliances or hierarchical relationships. And it gets stranger. The more closely scholars examine the PU evidence, the more unexpected the findings become. The burial practices of the PU, which involve cremation and the interment of ashes in ceramic urns, are consistent with Theravada Buddhist practice. This is significant because Theravada Buddhism, the branch of Buddhism that is practiced today in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka, is generally thought to have become dominant in mainland Southeast Asia only in the 11th and 12th centuries, during the Bagan period. If the PU were practicing Theravada Buddhist cremation rites as early as the first few centuries of the Common Era, then the history of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia needs to be pushed back by several hundred years. The evidence for early Puryu Buddhism comes not only from burial practices, but also from the Buddhist architecture at the Puryu sites. The stupas, monastery foundations, and votive tablets found at Baekthano, Halin, and Sri Kshetra display characteristics that scholars have associated with both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhist traditions. Some scholars have argued that the Puryu practiced a form of Buddhism that combined elements from multiple traditions, a syncretic Buddhism that predated the later dominance of a more orthodox Theravada tradition. Others have argued that the evidence points to a primarily Theravada practice from an early date. The debate is unresolved, partly because the evidence is limited, and partly because the categories of Theravada and Mahayana, which are useful for describing later Buddhist traditions, may not apply neatly to the fluid religious landscape of early Southeast Asia. The archaeological evidence from Sri Kshetra also includes a remarkable collection of gold artifacts that were discovered in the late 20th century. These gold objects, which include small figurative sculptures, decorative plaques, and ritual objects, demonstrate a level of metalworking skill that is extraordinary by any standard. The gold was worked using techniques including repousse, filigree, and granulation, techniques that require specialized tools, extensive training, and a deep understanding of the properties of the metal. Some of the gold objects depict Buddhist figures and scenes, confirming the association of gold working with religious patronage. Others depict secular subjects, including animals and geometric patterns, suggesting that gold was used for both religious and secular purposes. The Kinbar Mound excavation at Sri Kshetra, conducted by the Myanmar Department of Archaeology, yielded a particularly important collection of gold and silver objects, including reliquary deposits that had been placed within a stupa foundation. These deposits, which included gold plates inscribed with Pali texts, silver coins, and small gold figurines, provide direct evidence of the religious practices associated with stupa construction. The act of placing precious objects within a stupa foundation was a form of merit-making, a religious practice in which the donor accumulated spiritual merit through the act of giving. The richness of the Kinbar deposits indicates that the donors, presumably the royal court or wealthy elite, had access to substantial resources and were willing to devote those resources to religious purposes. The variety and quality of the material culture at Sri Kshetra paint a picture of a wealthy, cosmopolitan, and culturally sophisticated society. The Puryu elite had access to gold, silver, and precious stones. They employed craftsmen of exceptional skill. They engaged with Buddhist intellectual traditions of considerable complexity, and they maintained trade connections that brought goods and ideas from across Asia into the heart of the Irrawaddy Valley. The Pali inscriptions found at Puryu sites add another dimension to this debate. Pali is the language of the Theravada Buddhist canon, and the presence of Pali inscriptions at Puryu sites suggests that the Puryu had access to and were using Theravada Buddhist texts. Some of the Pali inscriptions at Sri Kshetra contain passages from the Abhidhamma, the philosophical section of the Pali canon, suggesting that the Puryu were not merely practicing Buddhist rituals, but were engaged with the intellectual tradition of Theravada Buddhist philosophy. This is a level of engagement that goes well beyond the simple adoption of Buddhist symbols and practices. It implies the existence of a learned Buddhist community, a sangha, with monks who could read, study, and interpret complex philosophical texts. The presence of Abhidhamma texts at Puryu sites has implications that extend beyond the question of which branch of Buddhism the Puryu practiced. The Abhidhamma is one of the most intellectually demanding sections of the Buddhist canon. It deals with the analysis of mind and mental states, the classification of phenomena, and the systematic elaboration of Buddhist philosophical principles. The study of the Abhidhamma requires advanced literacy, sustained intellectual effort, and a community of scholars who can teach, discuss, and transmit these complex philosophical ideas. The fact that the Puryu had access to and were engaging with the Abhidhamma implies the existence of a monastic intellectual culture of considerable sophistication, a community of monks who were not merely performing rituals, but were engaged in serious philosophical study. This monastic intellectual culture is largely invisible in the archaeological record because it was sustained by texts written on perishable materials rather than carved in stone. The manuscripts that the PU monks studied, the texts from which they taught, the commentaries they may have written, have all perished. We know they existed because the inscriptions refer to Buddhist texts and practices that presuppose a body of literature, but the literature itself is gone, and with it the intellectual world of the Pyu Sangha, the community of monks who were the custodians of Buddhist learning in the Irrawaddy Valley for centuries. The loss of this intellectual tradition is one of the most significant consequences of the Pyu decline. Buddhism is a text-based religion. Its teachings are preserved in scriptures that are studied, memorized, and transmitted from teacher to student. The Theravada Buddhist tradition places particular emphasis on the preservation of the Pali Canon, the collection of texts that are regarded as the authentic teachings of the Buddha. If the PU possessed copies of the Pali Canon, and the evidence suggests they did, then the loss of those copies when the PU cities declined would have been a significant blow to the Buddhist literary tradition in mainland Southeast Asia. The later transmission of the Pali Canon to the Bamar civilization at Bagan may have drawn on surviving PU sources, but this is speculative, and the extent of textual continuity between the PU and Bagan Buddhist traditions remains unclear. The Chinese sources provide an external perspective that supplements the archaeological and epigraphic evidence. The Tang Dynasty chronicle, known as the Manchu, or Book of the Southern Barbarians, compiled by Fan Chou in the 9th century, describes the PU kingdom in some detail. According to this text, the PU practiced Buddhism, and their society was characterized by a gentleness and civility that impressed the Chinese observer. The PU kingdom, according to Fan Chou, had 18 dependent states, indicating a political structure that extended well beyond the walls of any single city. The text describes the Pyu as a people who valued music, who wore cotton clothing, and who followed Buddhist precepts in their daily lives, including the prohibition against killing. The Manchu's description of the Pyu is one of the most detailed external accounts of any pre-modern Southeast Asian society. It describes a kingdom with a structured government, a legal system based on Buddhist principles, and a culture that valued education, music, and religious piety. According to Fan Chou, the Pyu punished criminals by flogging rather than by execution, reflecting the Buddhist prohibition against killing. Children were educated in Buddhist monasteries, where they learned to read and write. The society was described as peaceful and orderly, with little crime, and a strong respect for religious authority. The reliability of the Manchu's account is debated. Chinese descriptions of foreign peoples in this period were often filtered through Chinese cultural categories and stereotypes, and some scholars have cautioned against taking the account at face value. But even if the details are coloured by Chinese assumptions, the broad outlines of the description are consistent with what we know of the PU from archaeological and inscriptional evidence. The existence of a literate, Buddhist, urbanized society in the Irrawaddy Valley, governed by rulers who maintained diplomatic relations with China, is confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence. The Manchu adds colour and texture to a picture that the archaeological record can only sketch in outline. The embassy of 802, mentioned earlier, provides additional detail. The PYU musicians who performed at the Chinese court are described as having played 12 different kinds of instruments and performed a repertoire of songs that the Chinese found exotic and beautiful. The Chinese court poet Bai Juyi wrote verses about the performance, describing the music as unlike anything heard in China. These descriptions, preserved by chance in the vast archives of the Tang Dynasty, are among the most vivid surviving accounts of PU cultural life. They suggest a civilization with a rich musical tradition, a tradition that has been entirely lost except for these fragmentary descriptions. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The PU did not disappear suddenly. They were not destroyed by a single catastrophic event, though one particular episode contributed significantly to their decline. In 832 of the Common Era, according to Chinese sources, the Nanzhao Kingdom, a Tai-speaking state based in what is now Yunnan province of China, raided the PU city-states and carried off a large number of the population as captives. The raid was devastating, but it did not end the PU. Archaeological and inscriptional evidence suggests that PU communities continued to exist for centuries after the Nanzhao raids, though their political and economic significance declined. The decline of the PU was also shaped by environmental factors. The dry zone of Myanmar is susceptible to climate variability, and changes in monsoon patterns, river courses, or rainfall amounts could have significant impacts on the agricultural productivity of the region. Some scholars have suggested that climate change during the 8th and 9th centuries may have contributed to the decline of the PIU cities, though the evidence for this hypothesis is currently limited. The sediment records and pollen analyses that could provide evidence of climate change during the PIU period have not been systematically collected or analysed for most PIU sites, representing an important gap in our understanding of the environmental context of PIU decline. The PIU did not die, they faded. Their culture did not end, it was transformed. The process by which the Pyonyu were absorbed into the Bamar world is one of the most important and least understood transitions in the history of Southeast Asia. The Bamar, or Burman, people who would eventually found the Kingdom of Bagan, were themselves relatively recent arrivals in the Irrawaddy Valley, probably migrating into the region from the north during the 9th and 10th centuries. When the Bamar arrived, they entered a landscape that had been shaped by centuries of PIU occupation. The irrigation systems, the Buddhist monasteries, the urban infrastructure, all of these were PIU creations that the Bamar inherited and adapted. The relationship between the PIU and the Bamar during the transitional period is poorly understood, but several scenarios are possible. The PIU may have been militarily subjugated by the Bamar. They may have been politically marginalized as the Bamar established their own ruling dynasties. They may have been socially absorbed through intermarriage and cultural assimilation, or, most likely, all of these processes occurred simultaneously, with different PIU communities experiencing different fates depending on their location, their resources, and their relationship to the incoming Bamar population. The evidence from Bagan itself is suggestive. The Kingdom of Bagan, which is conventionally dated from the mid-9th to the late 13th century, is one of the great cultural achievements of Southeast Asian history. The temples of Bagan, numbering over 2,000 surviving structures on the plains of central Myanmar, are among the most impressive concentrations of religious architecture in the world. The Bagan builders worked in brick, the same material used by the PIU, and their construction techniques show continuities with PIU building traditions. The Buddhist practices that flourished at Bagan, including the Theravada Buddhist tradition that became the dominant form of Buddhism in Myanmar, may have their roots in the earlier PIU Buddhist tradition. The scholar Michael Angthwin has argued that the conventional narrative of Bagan's founding, which attributes the kingdom's establishment to a Bamar king named Anaurata in the mid-11th century, may overemphasize the discontinuity between the PIU and Bagan periods. Angthwin suggests that the transition was more gradual and more complex than the traditional narrative implies, with PIU cultural elements being absorbed into the emerging Bamar kingdom over an extended period, rather than being replaced overnight by a new cultural order. If this interpretation is correct, then the Kingdom of Bagan was not a fresh start but a continuation, a new phase in a civilizational tradition that stretched back to the PIU city-states of the first centuries of the Common Era. Their cities contracted, their political structures weakened, their population was gradually absorbed into the emerging Bamar, or Burman, civilization that would eventually found the Kingdom of Bagan. The Nanzhao Raid of 832 is one of the few specific historical events in PIU history that can be dated with reasonable confidence, thanks to the Chinese sources that record it. According to the Manchu and other Tang Dynasty texts, the Nanzhao forces attacked the PIU cities, carrying off thousands of captives who were resettled in the Nanzhao territories of Yunnan. The scale of the deportation, if the Chinese figures are even approximately accurate, would have been catastrophic for the PIU population. The removal of a significant portion of the urban population, including presumably craftsmen, monks, administrators, and other skilled individuals, would have crippled the ability of the PU cities to function. But the PU did not disappear immediately after the Nanzhao raids. Archaeological evidence suggests that occupation of the PU sites continued, though at a reduced scale, for several centuries after the raids. PRU inscriptions dating to the 9th and 10th centuries have been found at Bagan and other sites, suggesting that PRU-speaking communities persisted in the Irrawaddy Valley well into the period of Bamar dominance. The process of linguistic and cultural absorption was gradual, unfolding over generations rather than years. Individual PRU communities may have maintained their language and identity for centuries after the political power of the PRU city-states had ended, much as Etruscan communities in Italy maintained elements of their distinct identity for centuries after the rise of Rome. The process of absorption, rather than destruction, is itself significant. It means that the POU did not leave behind a dramatic narrative of collapse that could capture the imagination. There was no fall of a great city, no last stand of a doomed king, no sack and burning that could serve as a memorable historical episode. Instead, there was a slow, quiet dissolution, a process in which one civilization gradually merged with another, losing its distinct identity over generations. The PRU language fell out of use, replaced by Burmese. The PRU script was supplanted by the Burmese script, which was derived from a different Indian prototype. The PRU cities were abandoned or repurposed, their bricks reused in later constructions, their monuments gradually buried by vegetation and sediment, and the memory of the PU as a distinct people with their own civilization faded, replaced by the narrative of the Bamar Kingdom of Bagan, which became the founding story of the Myanmar national identity. The disappearance of the PU city-states follows a pattern that recurs across the ancient world. Civilizations rise, flourish, and then fade, sometimes leaving behind monuments that endure for millennia, sometimes leaving behind almost nothing. To understand the PU case, we need to examine this broader pattern of civilizational impermanence and ask what it reveals about the nature of memory, knowledge, and historical survival. Let us begin with the civilization that most closely parallels the PU in both geography and historical trajectory. The Funan Kingdom, or more accurately the polity that Chinese sources call Funan, occupied the lower Mekong Delta region of what is now Cambodia and southern Vietnam from roughly the 1st to the 6th century of the Common Era. Funan is described in Chinese historical sources as a powerful maritime trading state that controlled the commerce flowing through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea. It had contacts with India and China, and its rulers adopted Hindu and Buddhist religious practices. The archaeological site of Ok Eo in the Mekong Delta has yielded evidence of long-distance trade, including Roman coins, Indian seals, and Chinese ceramics, suggesting that Funan was a node in the maritime trading networks that linked the Roman Mediterranean to Han China. The parallels with the PU are striking. Both Funan and the PU city-states represent early civilizations in mainland Southeast Asia that adopted Indian religious and cultural traditions while maintaining their own distinct identities. Both are known primarily from Chinese historical sources and from archaeological evidence, rather than from internal literary traditions. Both have been the subject of scholarly debate about the nature and extent of Indian influence on their development, and both have been largely forgotten by the broader public, overshadowed by the later civilizations that succeeded them. The concept of Funan itself has been subjected to significant scholarly revision in recent decades. The historian Michael Vickery has argued that Funan was not a single, unified state, but rather a collection of loosely connected polities that Chinese sources, for reasons of administrative convenience, grouped together under a single name. If Vickery's interpretation is correct, then the analogy with the PU is even stronger. The PU, too, were not a single unified state, but a collection of city-states that shared a common language, a common religion, and common cultural traditions, while maintaining a degree of political independence. The Chinese sources, which are our primary external source for both Funan and the PU, may have imposed a false unity on what were actually diverse and decentralized political landscapes. The question of political organization is central to understanding the PU. Were the PU cities independent city-states, each with its own ruler and its own political system? or were they part of a larger political entity, a kingdom or empire, in which one city exercised authority over the others? The evidence does not provide a clear answer. The Chinese sources speak of the Piyu as a single kingdom, but Chinese observers may have projected their own concepts of political organization onto a very different reality. The archaeological evidence suggests that each Piyu city had its own walls, its own religious architecture, and its own administrative infrastructure, which would be consistent with a city-state model. But the shared cultural features of the Piyu cities, their common script, their common religious practices, and their common material culture suggest a degree of unity that goes beyond mere neighborliness. The scholar Michael Oung Thwin, whose work on the early history of Myanmar is foundational for the field, has argued that the PU political system was probably a network of semi-autonomous city-states, linked by shared cultural identity and by trade, but without a single dominant political center that exercised authority over all others. This model, which is similar to the city-state systems of ancient Mesopotamia and classical Greece, would explain both the shared cultural features and the apparent independence of the individual cities. It would also help explain why the PU did not produce a single unified kingdom with a continuous royal dynasty of the kind that characterizes later Burmese and Khmer states. The differences are also instructive. Funan occupied a maritime position that gave it access to the lucrative sea trade between India and China. The PU occupied an inland position that connected them to overland trade routes rather than maritime commerce. This geographic difference had consequences for the kind of wealth the two civilizations accumulated and for the archaeological evidence they left behind. Funan's maritime trade brought exotic goods from distant lands, goods that are dramatically visible in the archaeological record. The PIU's overland trade was likely more modest in volume and less likely to produce the kind of spectacular imported artifacts that attract scholarly attention. The decline of Funan, like the decline of the PU, was a process of gradual supersession. Funan was eventually absorbed by the rising power of Chenla, a state that emerged from the interior of Cambodia and eventually gave rise to the Khmer Empire. The Funan polity did not end in a dramatic catastrophe. It was gradually outcompeted, its territory absorbed, its population incorporated into a new political order. The parallel with the PU's absorption into the Burma civilization is clear. In both cases, one civilization was supplanted by another that built upon its foundations but did not preserve its memory. Now let us consider the Indus Valley Civilization, the great Bronze Age urban culture of the Indian subcontinent. The parallels with the PU may seem distant, given the vast differences in geography and chronology, but they are revealing. The Indus Valley Civilization, like the PU, built major walled cities with sophisticated urban infrastructure. It developed a script that has never been fully deciphered. It maintained trade connections with distant civilizations, and it declined gradually, its urban character diminishing over centuries rather than collapsing in a single event. The Indus Valley Civilization was entirely unknown to modern scholarship until the excavations of Dayaram Sani and Rakul Das Banerjee in 1921. Before that date, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban civilizations of the ancient world was simply invisible. The PU are in a similar position today. They are known to specialists, but they are invisible to the general public. Their cities are excavated, their inscriptions are studied, their artifacts are displayed in the National Museum in Yangon, but the vast majority of the world's population has never heard of them, and even those who study the ancient world are often unfamiliar with their achievements. The POU are the Indus Valley Civilization of Southeast Asia, waiting for the moment when their story breaks through into mainstream historical consciousness. The comparison between the POU and the Indus Valley Civilization extends to the question of script and decipherment. The Indus Valley script, which appears on thousands of seals, pottery fragments, and other artifacts, has resisted all attempts at full decipherment despite decades of effort by scholars around the world. The PUU script, derived from an Indian model, has been partially deciphered, but many aspects of the PU language remain uncertain. In both cases, the inability to fully read the script severely limits our understanding of the civilization that produced it. We can see the physical remains of these civilizations, their cities, their artifacts, their infrastructure, but we cannot hear their voices. We cannot read their laws, their literature, their correspondence, or their administrative records. We are reduced to interpreting material remains without the textual context that would give those remains their full meaning. The scholar I.W. Mabbitt, in his comparative study of early Southeast Asian states, has argued that the urbanization of Southeast Asia in the first millennium of the Common Era represents one of the most important but least studied chapters in the global history of urbanization. Mabbitt notes that the early cities of Southeast Asia, including the PU cities, the cities of Funan, and the early urban centers of Java, developed in tropical environments that posed distinct challenges for urban life. Heat, humidity, monsoon flooding, tropical diseases, and the rapid decay of organic building materials all made urban life in the tropics more challenging than in the temperate zones where the best-studied ancient cities were located. The success of the PRU in building and maintaining large urban centers in a tropical dry zone for centuries is therefore a significant achievement in the global history of urbanization, one that deserves to be studied alongside the urbanization of Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Mediterranean. The question of population is central to understanding the significance of the PU cities. How many people lived within the walls of Sri Kshetra? Estimates vary widely, from as few as 5,000 to as many as 50,000 or more. The difficulty of estimating population is common to all ancient cities, and the problem is compounded in the PUU case by the uncertainty about the density of occupation within the walled area. If the city was densely packed, with buildings covering most of the enclosed area, then the population could have been in the tens of thousands. If, as some scholars have suggested, the walled area included substantial open spaces, gardens, and agricultural land, then the population may have been significantly smaller. The archaeologist Elizabeth Moore has proposed that the PYU cities may have had a dual function, serving as both urban centres and agricultural enclosures. In this model, the city walls enclosed not only residential and religious buildings, but also rice paddies, orcharding, and water management features that were essential to the city's food supply. If this interpretation is correct, then the size of the walled enclosure may be a misleading indicator of urban population because a significant portion of the enclosed area was devoted to agriculture rather than habitation. Moore's model has the advantage of explaining how a city in the dry zone could sustain its population without depending entirely on food imports from outside the walls, but it also means that the PYU cities were fundamentally different in character from the compact, densely populated cities of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions. Regardless of the exact population figures, the existence of large, walled urban centres in the Irrawaddy Valley from the early centuries of the Common Era onward is a significant fact in the history of Southeast Asian urbanization. The PRU cities were among the earliest urban centres in mainland Southeast Asia, predating the great urban complexes of Angkor and Bagan by several centuries. They demonstrate that the conditions for urban life, surplus agricultural production, social stratification, specialized craft production, and organized governance existed in mainland Southeast Asia well before the period that is conventionally associated with the rise of the great kingdoms. The numbers are striking when we compare the scale of the PU cities to their contemporaries. Sri Kshetra, at 14 square kilometers, was larger than many of the great cities of the ancient world. The walled area of classical Athens, within the Themistoclean walls, was approximately 2.5 square kilometers. The walled area of Angkor Thom, the great Khmer capital, was roughly 9 square kilometers. Sri Kshetra was larger than both, and Helene, at roughly 600 hectares, was larger than the walled area of many medieval European cities. The PU were not building villages. They were building some of the largest urban enclosures in the ancient and medieval world. The comparison with the Khmer Empire deserves extended attention, because the Khmer case illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of archaeological recovery. Angkor was rediscovered by European explorers in the 19th century and immediately became the subject of intense scholarly and popular interest. The French colonial administration in Cambodia invested heavily in the study and restoration of Angkor, turning it into one of the most studied archaeological sites in Asia. The result is that Angkor is now one of the best-known ancient cities in the world, the subject of countless books, documentaries, and tourist guides. The disparity in archaeological investment between Angkor and the PU cities is not merely a matter of historical accident. It reflects deeper patterns of colonial interest, scholarly fashion, and economic development that have shaped the study of Southeast Asian archaeology. The French colonial interest in Angkor was partly motivated by a desire to demonstrate the cultural superiority of the Indo-European past, a past that the French saw themselves as inheriting and restoring. The PU cities, located in a British colonial territory rather than a French one, did not attract the same kind of sustained archaeological investment. The British colonial administration in Burma was more interested in administrative efficiency and economic extraction than in archaeological research, and the study of Burmese antiquities received far less attention and funding than the study of Angkor received from the French. The legacy of colonial-era priorities continues to shape the archaeological landscape of Southeast Asia. Angkor benefits from decades of accumulated scholarship, well-developed infrastructure for research and tourism, and a large international community of scholars who study the site. The POU cities lack all of these advantages. The archaeological infrastructure in Myanmar is limited. The international scholarly community working on the PYU is small, and the tourism infrastructure at the PYU sites is minimal. Closing the gap between Angkor and the POU cities will require sustained investment in archaeological research, training, and infrastructure that goes well beyond what has been committed to date. The PIU cities have had no comparable champion, no colonial power invested in their study and restoration, no international scholarly community devoted decades of concentrated effort to their excavation and publication. The Myanmar government has made efforts to preserve and study the PU sites, and the UNESCO World Heritage inscription has brought some international attention. But the resources available for archaeological research in Myanmar are a fraction of what has been devoted to Angkor, and the PYU sites remain far less well known, far less visited, and far less studied than their Khmer counterparts. A comparison with the Dvaravati civilization of Thailand offers another parallel. Dvaravati was a Mon-speaking civilization that flourished in the Chao Phraya River basin of central Thailand from roughly the 6th to the 11th century of the Common Era. Like the PU, the Dvaravati civilization practiced Theravada Buddhism and left behind evidence of sophisticated urban centers with Buddhist monasteries and stupas. Like the PU, Dvaravati was eventually absorbed by a successor civilization, in this case the Khmer, and later the Thai kingdoms. And like the PU, Dvaravati is poorly known to the general public, overshadowed by the more famous civilizations that came after it. The Dvaravati case is relevant to the PU for another reason. The Mon people, who are linguistically related to the Khmer, and who inhabited regions of both Thailand and Myanmar, may have had close connections with the PU. Some scholars have argued that the PU and Mon civilizations were in contact and may have shared certain cultural features, including Buddhist religious practices and artistic traditions. The relationship between the PU and Mon is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate, but the possibility of cultural exchange between these two early Southeast Asian civilizations suggests a more interconnected landscape than the fragmentary evidence might initially suggest. The Mon-PU connection raises important questions about the cultural landscape of mainland Southeast Asia before the arrival of the Thai and Burma peoples. In the first millennium of the Common Era, mainland Southeast Asia was inhabited by a diverse array of peoples, including the Mon, the PU, the Khmer, the Cham, and various highland groups. These peoples spoke different languages, practiced different variants of Buddhism and Hinduism, and organized their societies in different ways. But they were connected by trade, by shared religious traditions, and by the cultural influence of India, which provided a common framework of ideas and practices that crossed linguistic and ethnic boundaries. The POU were part of this interconnected cultural landscape, and their decline was not an isolated event, but part of a broader transformation that reshaped the demographic and political map of mainland Southeast Asia. The arrival of the Thai peoples from southern China, which began in earnest in the 11th and 12th centuries, transformed the political landscape of what is now Thailand and Laos. The arrival of the Bamar in the Irrawaddy Valley transformed the political landscape of what is now Myanmar. In both cases, the incoming peoples absorbed elements of the existing cultural landscape, including Buddhist religious practices, hydraulic engineering techniques, and urban traditions, while imposing in their own languages and political structures. The PU were among the first casualties of this great transformation. But they were not the last. The Mon, the Cham, and other early Southeast Asian peoples were similarly marginalized, their territories absorbed, their populations assimilated, their civilizational achievements attributed to the successor cultures that built upon them. The Bronze Age collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean, which struck around 1200 before the Common Era, provides a contrasting model of civilizational decline. The Bronze Age collapse was a systemic failure in which multiple interconnected civilizations, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the trading city of Ugarit, all experienced severe disruption within a relatively short period. The archaeologist Eric Klein has argued that the collapse was the result of multiple simultaneous stresses, including drought, famine, earthquake, invasion, and the disruption of trade networks. The interconnection of these civilizations, which had been a source of strength during the late Bronze Age, became a vulnerability when the system came under stress, because the failure of one node cascaded through the entire network. The PU decline was not a systemic collapse of this kind. The POU city-states were not embedded in a tightly interconnected international system in the same way that the Bronze Age palace civilizations were. Their decline was driven primarily by the specific shock of the Nanzhao raids and the longer-term process of absorption into the Bamar civilization. But the Bronze Age parallel is useful because it illustrates how interconnection can be both a strength and a vulnerability, and because it shows that even the most sophisticated civilizations can be disrupted by external shocks that overwhelm their capacity to respond. The concept of systemic fragility, which Klein uses to explain the Bronze Age collapse, is relevant to the PU case in another way. The PU city-states were embedded in a network of trade routes that connected them to India, China, and maritime Southeast Asia. This network provided economic resources, cultural inputs, and diplomatic relationships that enriched and sustained the PYU cities. But the network also made the PU vulnerable to disruptions that originated outside their control. The rise of the Nanzhao Kingdom in Yunnan disrupted the PU's northern connections. The expansion of Thai-speaking peoples into mainland Southeast Asia altered the demographic and political landscape of the region, and the gradual shift of maritime trade routes away from the Bay of Bengal toward the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea may have reduced the economic importance of the PU's position in the regional trading network. The PIU case also illustrates the distinction between collapse and transformation. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed in the sense that their palace-based political systems disintegrated and their urban populations dispersed. But the people themselves did not disappear. They continued to live in the same regions, practicing agriculture, maintaining local traditions, and eventually building new civilizations on the ruins of the old. The PIU experienced a similar process. Their city-state system declined, but their population was not exterminated. It was absorbed into a new political and cultural framework, the Bamar Kingdom of Bagan, that built upon PU foundations while developing its own distinct identity. Göbekli Tepe, the megalithic site in southeastern Turkey that dates to roughly 9600 before the Common Era, challenges our assumptions about the prerequisites for civilizational achievement. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed agriculture, and yet they mobilized the labor and skills needed to quarry, carve, transport, and erect massive stone monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the conventional model of civilizational development, which assumes that agriculture must precede urbanization and monumental construction, is too simple. The PU challenge our assumptions in a different way. They demonstrate that a major urban civilization could exist in mainland Southeast Asia at a time when European scholars assumed that the region was a cultural backwater, a passive recipient of Indian and Chinese influence, rather than a site of independent civilizational development. Cahokia, the great mound city in the Mississippi Valley, offers yet another point of comparison. Cahokia, at its peak around 1100 of the Common Era, was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. Its central feature, Monk's Mound, is the largest earthwork in the Americas. Like the PU cities, Cahokia was located in a river valley, where the management of water and agricultural resources was essential to sustaining a large urban population. Like the PU, Cahokia was eventually abandoned, its population dispersing to smaller settlements as the social and environmental conditions that had sustained the city changed. And, like the PU, Cahokia has been largely forgotten by mainstream history, its existence unknown to most people even in the country where it was built. The archaeologist Timothy Pocketat has argued that Cahokia's rise and fall reflect the inherent instability of complex systems that depend on ideological authority rather than established institutional structures. Cahokia may have been sustained by a charismatic religious or political movement that could generate enormous social energy in the short term, but could not maintain itself over the long term. When the movement lost its momentum, the city lost its raison d'etre, and the population dispersed. The relevance to the PU is suggestive. The PRU city-states may have been sustained, in part, by the religious authority of Buddhism, which provided a framework for social organization, moral conduct, and political legitimacy. When the political and demographic conditions changed, when the Nanzhao raids disrupted the population and the Burma migration introduced a new ethnic and political dynamic, the religious framework that had sustained the PUR cities may no longer have been sufficient to maintain them. The question of why some civilizations are remembered and others forgotten is itself a subject worthy of sustained inquiry. The sociologist Maurice Halbwachs argued that memory is always social, that what a society remembers is determined by the needs and interests of the present rather than by the intrinsic importance of the past. Applied to the PU, Halbwachs's framework suggests that the PU were forgotten because no subsequent society had a strong interest in remembering them. The Burma civilization that succeeded the PU was focused on constructing its own identity, its own founding narrative, its own relationship to the Buddhist tradition. The PU were a predecessor, but not one that the Burma needed to remember in order to legitimate their own power. The founding narrative of the Bamar Kingdom of Bagan did not require reference to the PU, and so the PU were allowed to fade from memory. The contrast with civilizations that are remembered is instructive. The Romans are remembered because the European civilizations that succeeded them claimed Roman heritage as the foundation of their own cultural identity. The Chinese imperial dynasties are remembered because the Chinese state maintained a continuous tradition of historical record-keeping that preserved the memory of each dynasty for the benefit of its successors. Even the Khmer Empire, which declined dramatically after the 15th century, was remembered by the Cambodian people who continued to live in the shadow of Angkor's monuments, and who preserved oral traditions about the great kings who had built them. The PU had none of these advantages. The Burma civilization that succeeded them did not claim PU heritage in any significant way. No continuous literary tradition recorded the achievements of the PU kings, and the physical remains of the PU cities, while impressive, were not as visually dramatic as the temple complexes of Angkor or Bagan, lacking the elaborately carved facades and towering spires that would have made them memorable to casual observers. The PU cities were functional rather than spectacular, impressive in their engineering but not in their ornamentation. This lack of visual drama may have contributed to their obscurity. In a world where the most remembered civilizations are often the ones that produced the most photogenic ruins, the Romans are remembered because the European civilizations that succeeded them claimed Roman heritage as the foundation of their own cultural identity. The Chinese imperial dynasties are remembered because the Chinese state maintained a continuous tradition of historical record-keeping that preserved the memory of each dynasty for the benefit of its successors. The PU had no such mechanism of preservation. No successor state claimed them as ancestors. No continuous literary tradition recorded their history. The PRU were the founders of a civilizational tradition, but the tradition they founded did not acknowledge them as founders. Each of these comparisons, Funan, the Indus Valley, the Khmer Empire, Dvaravati, the Bronze Age collapse, Göbekli Tepe, and Cahokia, illuminates a different facet of the PRU problem. They show that civilizational impermanence is the norm rather than the exception, that major urban civilizations can be forgotten as well as remembered, and that the factors determining which civilizations are remembered have as much to do with the circumstances of scholarship and memory as with the intrinsic importance of the civilizations themselves. The anthropologist Joseph Tainter, in his study of the collapse of complex societies, argued that civilizations collapse when the costs of maintaining their complexity exceed the benefits. Applied to the PRU, Tainter's framework suggests a civilization in which the costs of maintaining urban infrastructure, irrigation systems, monastic communities, and trade networks gradually outstripped the benefits, particularly after the disruption caused by the Nanjiao raids. The PRU cities may have become economically unsustainable, their populations finding it more advantageous to disperse into smaller, less costly settlements than to continue investing in the maintenance of large urban centres. The economic historian Kenneth Hall, whose work on the maritime trade of Southeast Asia has illuminated the commercial networks that connected the region to the broader Indian Ocean world, has argued that the economic vitality of Southeast Asian polities was closely linked to their ability to control and tax trade flows. States that controlled key nodes in the trading network, strategic ports, mountain passes, or river junctions, could extract revenue from passing commerce and use that revenue to fund the military, religious, and administrative activities that sustained their power. When trade routes shifted or when control of key nodes was lost, the economic foundation of these states could erode rapidly. Applied to the PRU, Hall's framework suggests that the PRU city-states derive significant economic benefit from their position on the overland trade routes connecting India and China. The Irrawaddy Valley was a natural corridor for overland commerce, and the PRU cities, located at strategic points along this corridor, were well positioned to control and tax the flow of goods. But this economic model was vulnerable to changes in the trade routes themselves. If maritime commerce through the Straits of Malacca offered a cheaper or safer alternative to the overland routes through Myanmar, then the economic rationale for the PRU's position would be undermined. The gradual expansion of maritime trade in Southeast Asia during the first millennium of the Common Era may have contributed to the economic marginalization of the PRU city-states, reducing the trade revenues that had sustained their urban infrastructure and their cultural activities. The historian Sheldon Pollock has described a phenomenon he calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, a vast cultural zone stretching from India through Southeast Asia, in which Sanskrit served as the language of political authority, religious practice, and literary expression. The PRU were part of this cosmopolis, participating in a shared cultural framework that linked them to India and to other Southeast Asian societies. But the cosmopolis was not a political entity. It was a cultural network, and like all networks, it was vulnerable to disruption. When the conditions that sustained the network changed, the connections it provided could weaken or break, leaving individual societies isolated and vulnerable. The PRU case demonstrates the fragility of cultural networks with particular clarity. The PRU were connected to India through Buddhism and to China through trade and diplomacy. These connections enriched PRU civilization and linked it to the broader currents of Asian history. But when the PRU city-states declined, those connections were severed or redirected, and the PRU found themselves isolated within a regional context that was being reshaped by new political forces. The Bamar, who eventually dominated the Irrawaddy Valley, brought their own cultural traditions and established their own connections to India and China, connections that did not require or value the preservation of PRU memory. The geographer David Harvey has argued that the production of space is always a political process, that the physical landscape of a society reflects the power relationships that organize it. The PYU production of space, the walled cities, the irrigation networks, the religious monuments, reflected a particular set of power relationships, a particular way of organizing society and managing resources. When the PYU political system was replaced by the Bamar system, the production of space changed as well. The Bamar built their own cities, their own temples, their own irrigation works. On top of and around the PU remains, the PYU landscape was overwritten by the Bamar landscape, and the physical traces of the older civilization were gradually buried, demolished, or repurposed. The process of landscape overwriting is not unique to Myanmar. It occurs everywhere that one civilization succeeds another in the same geographic space. The layers of construction beneath modern Rome, with Etruscan foundations beneath Republican buildings, beneath imperial structures, beneath medieval churches, are a classic example. The PU cities too are layered sites, with Bagan period and later structures overlying the PU remains. But the layering at the PIU sites has received far less systematic archaeological investigation than the layering at Troy or Rome, and the PIU levels remain incompletely explored. The situation at Bagan itself illustrates the problem. The great temple complex of Bagan, with its thousands of Buddhist monuments, sits on a landscape that was previously occupied by PUU communities. Some of the Bagan period structures may incorporate PU-era foundations or building materials. The relationship between the PU and Bagan layers at the site has not been systematically investigated, partly because the Bagan temples are themselves protected monuments, and partly because the focus of archaeological attention at Bagan has been on the Bagan period remains rather than on what lies beneath them. A systematic investigation of the PU layers at Bagan could potentially yield information of enormous importance for understanding the transition from the PU to the Bamar period, but such an investigation would require resources and institutional support that have not yet been committed. It occurs everywhere that one civilization succeeds another in the same geographic space. The layers of construction beneath modern Rome, with Etruscan foundations beneath Republican buildings, beneath imperial structures, beneath medieval churches, are a classic example. The layers of construction at Troy, where 9 successive cities were built on the same site over 3,000 years, are another. The PU cities, too, are layered sites, with Bagan period and later structures overlying the PU remains. But the layering at the PU sites has received far less systematic archaeological investigation than the layering at Troy or Rome, and the PRU levels remain incompletely explored that was being reshaped by new political forces. The Bamar, who eventually dominated the Irrawaddy Valley, brought their own cultural traditions and established their own connections to India and China, connections that did not require or value the preservation of PU memory. The deeper truth about the PU city-states is not simply that they were forgotten. It is that their forgetting reveals fundamental flaws in how we construct the history of Southeast Asia and, by extension, the history of the world. The standard narrative of Southeast Asian history, as it has been taught in universities and presented in textbooks for the better part of a century, begins with a concept called Indianization. According to this narrative, the civilizations of Southeast Asia were created by the diffusion of Indian cultural influence, including Hindu and Buddhist religion, Sanskrit language and literature, Indian political concepts, and Indian artistic traditions into the indigenous societies of the region. The civilizations that resulted, Funan, Champa, Srivijaya, the Khmer Empire, and the kingdoms of Java, are described as products of this Indianization process, local societies that were transformed by the adoption of Indian cultural models. The Indianization model has been criticized by Southeast Asian scholars and by revisionist historians for decades, and it has been significantly modified in contemporary scholarship. The critics argue that the model overstates the role of Indian influence and understates the agency and creativity of Southeast Asian societies. They point out that the societies of Southeast Asia were not blank slates onto which Indian culture was simply written. They had their own social structures, their own religious beliefs, their own artistic traditions, and their own economic systems before they came into contact with Indian traders and missionaries. The adoption of Indian cultural elements was a selective process in which Southeast Asian societies chose to adopt certain Indian practices and reject others, adapting what they adopted to local conditions and combining it with indigenous traditions. The debate about Indianization has been enriched in recent years by new archaeological evidence and by the application of theoretical frameworks drawn from post-colonial studies. The concept of localization, proposed by the historian O.W. Walters, offers an alternative to the Indianization model. Walters argued that Southeast Asian societies did not simply receive Indian cultural influence, they localized it, adapting Indian ideas and practices to their own cultural contexts and producing local variants that were distinct from the Indian originals. The PU city-states are an excellent example of localization in action. They adopted Indian Buddhism, but they practiced it in ways that reflected local conditions and local traditions. They used an Indian-derived script, but they adapted it to write a language that was entirely unrelated to any Indian language. They built Buddhist stupas, but they developed their own distinctive stupa forms that were not simply copies of Indian prototypes. The concept of localization shifts the focus from what was received to what was done with it. It recognizes that cultural transmission is always a creative process, not a passive one. The PU did not simply adopt Indian Buddhism. They made it their own, integrating it with local beliefs and practices, adapting it to the specific conditions of the dry zone, and developing institutional forms, monastic communities, irrigation-based economies, merit-making practices that reflected local priorities and local needs. This creative appropriation is itself a civilizational achievement, one that deserves recognition on its own terms rather than being dismissed as mere derivation. The PU city-states are a powerful test case for this revisionist perspective, but they also reveal its limitations. The concept of localization, while useful, can sometimes understate the degree of genuine innovation involved in the cultural synthesis practiced by Southeast Asian societies. The PU did not merely localize Indian Buddhism. They created a form of Buddhist civilization that was adapted to the specific conditions of the dry zone, with its particular challenges of water management, its seasonal rhythms of monsoon and drought, and its social structures rooted in the management of irrigation infrastructure. This was not localization in the sense of making minor adjustments to an imported model. It was a creative act of civilizational construction, in which Indian Buddhist principles provided a framework that was filled with content drawn from local experience, local knowledge, and local needs. The archaeologist Ian Glover, whose work on the early metallurgy and trade of Southeast Asia has contributed significantly to our understanding of the region's prehistoric and early historic periods, has argued that Southeast Asian societies were active participants in the technological and cultural exchanges that characterized the first millennium of the Common Era. They were not passive recipients of Indian or Chinese technology, but creative adapters who selected, modified, and improved upon the technologies and ideas they encountered. The PU exemplified this pattern: their iron smelting at Halin, their hydraulic engineering in the dry zone, their adaptation of an Indian script to a Tibeto-Burman language, and their development of a distinctive stupa architecture all represent creative responses to local conditions, not mere imitations of foreign models. The deeper truth extends to the question of knowledge itself. For this revisionist perspective, the PIU clearly adopted Indian cultural elements including Buddhism, the concept of the stupa, the use of a script derived from Indian models, and the iconography of Indian religious art. But they also maintained distinctly non-Indian features, including their Tibeto-Burman language, their distinctive burial practices, their particular approach to urban planning and hydraulic engineering, and their own artistic conventions. The PU were not passive recipients of Indian culture. They were active agents who selected, adapted, and transformed the elements of Indian civilization that they found useful, producing a cultural synthesis that was distinctly their own. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of how cultural transmission works. Cultures do not simply absorb foreign influences whole. They filter them, modify them, combine them with indigenous traditions, and produce new forms that are different from both the imported model and the pre-existing local tradition. The PU did this with Indian Buddhism, creating a form of Buddhist practice and art that was recognizably Buddhist but also recognizably PU. And this creative act of cultural synthesis is precisely what has been obscured by the Indianization model, which treats Southeast Asian civilizations as derivatives of Indian civilization, rather than as independent creative traditions in their own right. The deeper truth extends to the question of knowledge itself. The PU developed hydraulic engineering techniques that transformed the dry zone of Myanmar into productive agricultural land. Those techniques were not derived from India. The dry zone of Myanmar has no counterpart in the Indian subcontinent, and the specific challenges of water management in that environment required local knowledge and local innovation. The PU irrigation systems were indigenous achievements, products of centuries of observation, experimentation, and adaptation to local conditions. When the PU cities declined, that hydraulic knowledge was not entirely lost. Some of it was inherited by the Bamar civilization that succeeded the PU, and some of the irrigation infrastructure built by the PIU may have continued to function long after the cities themselves were abandoned. But the specific PIU knowledge of how to design, build, and maintain these systems, the engineering expertise that represented centuries of accumulated experience, was dissipated as the PU population was absorbed into the Bamar world. Let that sink in. The knowledge of how to sustain large urban populations in a semi-arid environment, knowledge that had been developed over centuries of practical experience, was largely lost when the civilization that produced it declined. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. The Romans developed concrete that could set underwater. The technique was lost for centuries after the fall of Rome. The ancient Egyptians moved and placed stone blocks of enormous weight with precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The methods were not recorded in a form that survived. The Maya developed a mathematical system that included the concept of zero. The knowledge was preserved only in a handful of codices that survived the Spanish colonial destruction. The knowledge lost when civilizations decline is not only technical, it is also social and organizational. The PU city-states had developed systems of governance that could coordinate the activities of large, diverse populations over extended periods. They had systems for allocating water rights, organizing labor, adjudicating disputes, collecting taxes, and managing religious institutions. These systems represented centuries of institutional learning, of trial and error, of adaptation and refinement. They were embodied in the practices of the people who operated them, in the customs and conventions that governed daily life, and in the unwritten rules and expectations that regulated social interaction. When the PU political system declined, these institutional skills were not automatically transferred to the successor society. The Bamar may have inherited the physical infrastructure of the PU, their fields and their canals, but the organizational knowledge that had built and maintained that infrastructure was the property of POU specialists, whose expertise could not be simply copied or transplanted. The concept of tacit knowledge, developed by the philosopher Michael Polanyi, is useful here. Tacit knowledge is knowledge that is difficult or impossible to articulate explicitly. It is the knowledge of the skilled craftsman who can throw a pot on a wheel but cannot fully explain in words how it is done. It is the knowledge of the experienced farmer who can read the signs of weather and soil that indicate when to plant and when to harvest. It is the knowledge of the administrator who understands the informal networks and unwritten rules that make a bureaucracy function. Tacit knowledge is transmitted through apprenticeship, through practice, through the sustained interaction between expert and novice. When the experts disappear, the tacit knowledge they carried disappears with them, and it cannot be recovered from written records because it was never written down. Each of these examples illustrates the same principle. Knowledge is embodied in people and institutions, not in abstract databases. When the people die and the institutions collapse, the knowledge they carried dies with them. The PU's hydraulic knowledge was not written in a textbook. It was held in the minds and hands of the engineers, the builders, the farmers, and the administrators who designed, constructed, and operated the irrigation systems. When those people were killed, displaced or absorbed into a new society that valued different skills, the knowledge they carried was diluted and eventually lost. The concept of institutional memory is relevant here. Large organizations, including states, develop institutional memories, accumulated knowledge about how to perform complex tasks, how to manage recurring problems, and how to coordinate the activities of large numbers of people. This institutional memory is embodied in personnel, in procedures, in organizational structures, and in the physical infrastructure of the organization. When an institution collapses, its institutional memory is dissipated. The individuals who carry pieces of the institutional memory may survive, but the organizational context that gave their knowledge its full meaning and utility is gone. The PU city-states were institutions in this sense, complex organizations that had developed institutional memories over centuries. When they declined, those institutional memories were scattered, and the organizational knowledge they contained was fragmented beyond recovery. It was held in the minds and hands of the engineers, the builders, the farmers, and the administrators who designed, constructed, and operated the irrigation systems. When those people were killed, displaced, or absorbed into a new society that valued different skills, the knowledge they carried was diluted and eventually lost. The fragility of knowledge is compounded by the fragility of the physical record. The POU built primarily in brick, a durable material that can survive for centuries under favorable conditions. But brick is not stone. It degrades over time, especially in a tropical climate where seasonal rains, vegetation growth, and insect activity all contribute to the deterioration of exposed structures. The stupas and monastery foundations that survive at the PU sites are the most durable remnants of a built environment that once included residential buildings, workshops, markets, warehouses, and other structures that were constructed of less permanent materials, wood, bamboo, thatch, and unfired earth. These less durable structures have entirely disappeared, leaving only the religious monuments as visible evidence of the cities that once surrounded them. The result is that our picture of the PU cities is systematically biased toward religious architecture. We can see the stupas and monastery foundations because they were built of brick and have survived. We cannot see the houses, the shops, the workshops, the granaries, and the other structures of daily life because they were built of perishable materials and have returned to the earth. The loss of the domestic architecture is particularly significant because it means we know almost nothing about how ordinary POU people lived. The religious architecture tells us about the beliefs and practices of the elite, the kings and monks, who commissioned the construction of stupas and monasteries. But the daily lives of farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and labourers, the vast majority of the PU population, are invisible in the archaeological record. We do not know what their houses looked like, how they were organised, or what furnishings and tools they contained. We do not know what they ate, beyond the general inference that rice was the staple crop. We do not know how they dressed, how they celebrated, how they mourned, or how they spent their leisure time. The PU commoner is the most invisible figure in the history of an already invisible civilization. This bias gives the impression that the POU cities were primarily religious centers toward religious architecture. We can see the stupas and monastery foundations because they were built of brick and have survived. We cannot see the houses, the shops, the workshops, the granaries, and the other structures of daily life because they were built of perishable materials and have returned to the earth. This bias gives the impression that the PU cities were primarily religious centers, places of worship and monastic learning. This impression is almost certainly misleading. The scale of the walled enclosures at Sri Kshetra and Halin, far larger than would be needed for religious purposes alone, implies urban populations engaged in a wide range of economic and social activities. But the physical evidence for those activities has largely disappeared. The archaeologist Bob Hudson, who has conducted extensive research at Sri Kshetra and other POU sites, has used satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to map features that are no longer visible on the surface. His work has revealed the outlines of structures, canal systems, and landscape modifications that are invisible to the naked eye but detectable through remote sensing technology. Hudson's research demonstrates that the PYU landscape was far more extensively modified than the surface evidence alone would suggest, and that the cities were embedded in a larger pattern of agricultural and hydraulic infrastructure that extended well beyond the city walls. The work of Hudson and other researchers has also revealed the environmental impact of the PYU civilization. Pollen analysis from sediment cores taken near PYU sites suggests that the landscape of the dry zone was significantly modified during the period of PYU occupation. Forests were cleared for agriculture, and the species composition of the remaining vegetation changed as the PYU selected for useful trees and plants while removing others. The PYU landscape was not a natural landscape. It was a managed landscape shaped over centuries by human activity to serve human needs. When the PYU cities declined and the population dispersed, the managed landscape gradually reverted to a more natural state, and the traces of PYU environmental management were overlaid by natural vegetation and sedimentation. This kind of research is essential for understanding the PYU, but it requires resources, expertise, and access that are not always available. Remote sensing technology is expensive. Archaeological fieldwork in Myanmar requires permits and logistical support that can be difficult to obtain, and the analytical work of interpreting remote sensing data requires specialized training that few researchers possess. The constraints on PYU research are not merely intellectual, they are practical, political, and financial. The political situation in Myanmar has added another layer of difficulty. The military coup of 2021 and the ongoing civil conflict have severely disrupted archaeological research in the country. International collaborations have been suspended or curtailed. Myanmar scholars face personal risks and professional uncertainties. The protection of archaeological sites, already inadequate before the crisis, has deteriorated further. The PYU ancient cities, which are located in a region that has seen significant military activity, are potentially at risk from military operations, refugee movements, and the general breakdown of law and order that accompanies armed conflict. The situation is a reminder that the study of the past is never separate from the politics of the present. The ability to investigate, preserve, and interpret archaeological sites depends on conditions of peace, stability, and institutional support that cannot be taken for granted. The PYU cities survived for over 1,000 years as functioning urban centers. They have survived for another 1,000 years as archaeological sites. Whether they will survive the current crisis intact is uncertain. Let that sink in. The civilization that built the largest walled city in Southeast Asia, that practiced Buddhism centuries before it became the dominant religion of the region, that developed irrigation systems capable of supporting large urban populations in a semi-arid environment, is poorly understood, not because the evidence does not exist, but because the resources and conditions needed to study that evidence have been lacking. The PYU are not invisible because they were unimportant. They are invisible because the circumstances of modern scholarship have conspired to keep them in the shadows. But it requires resources, expertise, and access that are not always available. Remote sensing technology is expensive. Archaeological fieldwork in Myanmar requires permits and logistical support that can be difficult to obtain. And the analytical work of interpreting remote sensing data requires specialized training that few researchers possess. The constraints on PYU research are not merely intellectual, they are practical, political, and financial. And those constraints have contributed significantly to the obscurity of the PYU in the broader historical narrative. Let that sink in. The civilization that built the largest walled city in Southeast Asia, that practiced Buddhism centuries before it became the dominant religion of the region, that developed irrigation systems capable of supporting large urban populations in a semi-arid environment, is poorly understood not because the evidence does not exist, but because the resources and conditions needed to study that evidence have been lacking. The PYU are not invisible because they were unimportant. They are invisible because the circumstances of modern scholarship have conspired to keep them in the shadows. What does the forgetting of the PYU city-states mean for our understanding of human history? It means that our map of the ancient world is incomplete in ways that are not merely incidental but structural. The PRU are not a minor footnote that could be safely omitted without affecting the larger narrative. They are a major civilization whose absence from the standard account of ancient history distorts our understanding of how Southeast Asia developed, how Buddhism spread, and how complex urban societies emerged in the tropical and subtropical environments of mainland Asia. The conventional narrative of Southeast Asian history moves from the early Indian-influenced states of Funan and Champa to the great kingdoms of Angkor, Bagan, and Sukhothai. In this narrative, the PU are either absent entirely or appear as a brief precursor to the more famous kingdom of Bagan. But the PU were not merely a precursor, they were the foundation. The kingdom of Bagan, which is conventionally dated from the 9th to the 13th century of the Common Era, was built on territory that had previously been part of the POU cultural sphere. The Bamar people who founded Bagan were influenced by PU culture in ways that are still being explored by scholars. The Buddhist practices that flourished at Bagan may have their roots in the earlier PU Buddhist tradition. The irrigation infrastructure that sustained agriculture in the dry zone may have originated with the PU. Even the concept of the walled royal capital, which was central to Bagan's self-presentation, may owe something to the PU model of the fortified urban centre. The question of PU-Bagan continuity is not merely academic. It has implications for how the people of Myanmar understand their own cultural heritage. If Bagan is understood as a purely Baymar creation, then the cultural achievements of the PU are invisible within the national narrative. But if Bagan is understood as a continuation and transformation of an earlier PUU tradition, then the PUU become part of the national story, a foundational chapter in a longer narrative of civilizational development in the Irrawaddy Valley. This reframing does not diminish the Bamar contribution. It enriches it by showing that the achievements of Bagan were built on foundations laid by an earlier civilization that had already developed many of the key elements: Buddhism, irrigation agriculture, urban planning, literacy, that the Bagan kingdom would later refine and expand. The relationship between the PU and Bagan is analogous in some respects to the relationship between the Etruscans and Rome. The Etruscans were the dominant civilization of central Italy before the rise of Rome, and their cultural influence on early Roman society was profound. Roman religious practices, urban planning, architectural forms, and political institutions all owed debts to Etruscan precedents, and yet the Etruscans are far less well known than the Romans, overshadowed by the later civilization that built upon their foundations. The PIU stand in a similar relationship to Bagan. They were the older civilization, the one that laid the groundwork, the one whose achievements were absorbed and transformed by the successor culture that eventually surpassed them. The PAU case also has implications for how we understand the history of Buddhism itself. The conventional narrative of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia treats the tradition as having been established in Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia during the 11th and 12th centuries, largely through the influence of the Sri Lankan Buddhist tradition. But the PU evidence suggests that Theravada Buddhism, or something very close to it, was practiced in Myanmar centuries before the conventional date of its establishment. If the PU were practicing Theravada Buddhist cremation rites and studying Abhidhamma texts in the early centuries of the Common Era, then the history of Theravada Buddhism in Southeast Asia needs to be fundamentally revised. The tradition did not arrive fully formed from Sri Lanka in the 11th century. It developed over a much longer period, with deep roots in the PU civilization of the first millennium. This revision has implications that extend well beyond the boundaries of academic Buddhist studies. Theravada Buddhism is practiced today by hundreds of millions of people in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. It shapes their moral values, their social practices, their political institutions, and their daily lives. Understanding the deep history of this tradition, tracing its roots back to the PU city-states of the first millennium, enriches the self-understanding of these communities and challenges the narrative of external imposition that has sometimes been associated with the spread of Buddhisms in Southeast Asia. Buddhism in Southeast Asia was not imposed from outside. It was adopted, adapted, and indigenized by local communities over centuries, beginning with the PU. The PYU evidence also challenges the conventional periodization of Southeast Asian history. The standard framework divides the history of the region into prehistoric, protohistoric, and historical periods, with the transition from protohistoric to historical typically dated to the appearance of the first inscriptions in Indian-influenced scripts. By this criterion, the PU enter the historical period relatively early, with inscriptions dating from the first centuries of the Common Era. But the significance of this early date has not been fully absorbed into the mainstream narrative of Southeast Asian history, which continues to treat the great kingdoms of the second millennium, Angkor, Bagan, Sukhothai, and Majapahit, as the primary subjects of study. The PIU, who precede all of these kingdoms by centuries, remain in the shadows, acknowledged in specialized literature, but absent from general accounts. The implications extend beyond the specific case of Myanmar. The PU city-states are evidence of a broader pattern in which the earliest civilizations of a region are systematically overlooked in favor of the later civilizations that built upon them. The Sumerians are overshadowed by the Babylonians and Assyrians. The Minoans are overshadowed by the Mycenaean Greeks. The Olmecs are overshadowed by the Maya and Aztecs. In each case, the foundational civilization, the one that developed the basic cultural toolkit upon which later societies built, receives less attention than the later civilization that refined and expanded that toolkit. This pattern is not a law of nature. It is a product of how we construct historical narratives, and it reflects a bias toward the dramatic, the large-scale, and the well-documented at the expense of the foundational, the experimental, and the fragmentary. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn argued that scientific revolutions occur when the existing paradigm, the framework within which normal science operates, is replaced by a new paradigm that better accounts for the available evidence. Something similar may be needed in the study of Southeast Asian history. The existing paradigm, which focuses on the great kingdoms and empires and treats earlier civilizations as mere precursors, needs to be replaced by a paradigm that gives equal weight to the foundational civilizations, that recognizes the Piyu, the Dvaravati, the Funan, and other early societies as major civilizations in their own right, not merely as stepping stones to the later kingdoms. The philosopher of history R.G. Collingwood argued that all history is the history of thought, that the task of the historian is to understand the thoughts and intentions of the people who made history. For the PU, this task is especially difficult because the evidence of PU thought is so limited. We can see what the PU built, but we cannot always understand why they built it. We can see their religious monuments, but we cannot always reconstruct the beliefs and practices that gave those monuments meaning. We could read fragments of their inscriptions, but we cannot always understand the full context in which those inscriptions were produced. The recovery of the PEU story requires not only the discovery and analysis of new evidence, but also an imaginative engagement with the PEU world, an effort to understand the PU on their own terms, rather than merely fitting them into frameworks developed for the study of other civilizations. The recovery of the PU story is not merely an academic exercise. It has implications for how the people of Myanmar understand their own past. The national narrative of Myanmar has traditionally focused on the Bamar ethnic group and its founding of the Bagan Kingdom. The PIU, who were a different people speaking a different language, do not fit neatly into this Bamar-centered narrative. Recognizing the PU as the foundational civilization of the Irrawaddy Valley means recognizing that the history of Myanmar is not simply the history of the Bamar, but the history of multiple peoples who have inhabited the region over millennia. This recognition is politically sensitive in a country where ethnic identity and historical narrative are deeply intertwined with contemporary political conflicts. The digital age offers new tools for the study and dissemination of PU history. Satellite imagery, LiDAR technology, and ground-penetrating radar can reveal features of the PU landscape that are invisible to the naked eye. Digital databases can make the scattered evidence from PU sites accessible to researchers worldwide. Online educational resources can bring the PYU story to audiences that have never heard of this civilization. The potential of these technologies is enormous, but their realization requires investment, collaboration, and a commitment to making the PU story part of the global historical narrative. The challenge is compounded by the fact that the PU left behind no easily accessible body of literature that could serve as an entry point for non-specialist readers. Rome has Virgil, Homer gives us Greece, the Mahabharata opens a door to ancient India. The PU have no equivalent. Their story must be told through archaeology, through the patient analysis of brick fragments and burial urns and coin types, through the slow accumulation of evidence that only specialists can interpret. This makes the PU story harder to tell, but it does not make it less important. Some of the most significant chapters of human history are written not in books but in the earth, and the willingness to read the earth, to learn its language, to listen to what it tells us, is the mark of a civilization that values truth over convenience. The challenge is ultimately one of imagination. We need to imagine a world in which the PU are as well known as the Khmer, in which the stelae and stupas of Sri Kshetra are as recognizable as the temples of Angkor, in which the name Baekthano carries the same weight as Mohenjo-Daro. This world does not yet exist, but the evidence that would make it possible is there, buried in the soil of the Irrawaddy Valley, waiting to be uncovered, studied, and shared with the world. In the dry zone of central Myanmar, when the monsoon retreats and the land turns brown, the brick stumps of the Barbagi stupa at Sri Kshetra catch the slanting afternoon light and glow with a warmth that seems to come from within the stone itself. The stupa has stood here for roughly 1400 years. It has weathered monsoons, earthquakes, wars, and the slow erosion of centuries. Its form is simpler than the elaborate gilded pagodas that would later define Burmese Buddhism. It is a cylinder rising to a gentle dome, unadorned, ungilded, quiet. It is the oldest surviving Buddhist monument in Myanmar, and it stands in a landscape where the traces of an entire civilization lie just beneath the surface, visible in the faint undulations of the earth, in the fragments of brick that emerge after each rainy season, in the outlines of walls and canals that satellite cameras can see, but human eyes cannot. The PU built this stupa. They built the canals that watered the fields that fed the city that surrounded it. They built the walls that enclosed 14 square kilometers of urban space. They cremated their dead and placed the ashes in urns decorated with symbols of a faith that they had carried from India and made their own. They developed a script to write their language and carved inscriptions that record. In fragments we can only partially read the deeds and dedications of a people who believed their works would endure. Their works did endure. The bricks are still here. The urns are still here. The foundations of their monasteries are still here. But the people are gone, absorbed into the Burmese world that grew up around and over them, their language extinct, their script unread, their names forgotten. The PU did not vanish in a catastrophe. They dissolved slowly over centuries, their identity diffusing into the larger identity of the Burma civilization that inherited their land, their irrigation systems, and perhaps some of their religious traditions, without inheriting their memory. This is the quietest kind of civilizational death, not the violent sack, the burning city, the genocidal conquest, but the slow erasure of identity, the gradual replacement of one language by another, one script by another, one set of names and stories and songs by another. The PU death was a death by absorption, a death in which the body of the civilization continued to function, its fields still watered, its cities still inhabited, but its soul, its distinct identity, its self-knowledge, was gradually dissolved. We do not know what the PU called themselves. The name PU comes from Burmese sources and may or may not reflect what the PU used as their own ethnic designation. We do not know the names of most of their kings. We do not know their myths, their proverbs, their songs. We know that they made music, because the Chinese chroniclers describe the PU musicians who performed at the Tang court, and the poet Bai Juyi wrote verses about their performance. But the music itself is gone. The melodies that the Chinese found so exotic and beautiful have not survived even as notation. They exist only as descriptions, words about sounds that no one alive today has ever heard. The PU musicians at the Tang court played 12 kinds of instruments. We know the names of some of those instruments, preserved in the Chinese records, but we do not know what they sounded like. We do not know the scales they used, the rhythms they played, the harmonies they achieved. 1,000 years of musical tradition, a tradition rich enough and distinctive enough to impress the musicians of the most culturally sophisticated court in Asia, has been reduced to a handful of sentences in a foreign chronicle. The silence where that music used to be is one of the most complete silences in the history of human culture. There is a lesson in this silence. It is the same lesson that echoes from the ruins of every forgotten civilization, from the unreadable script of the Indus Valley to the abandoned mounds of Cahokia, from the jungle-shrouded temples of Angkor to the crumbling stelae of Axum. The lesson is that permanence is an illusion. The grandest monuments, the most sophisticated cities, the most beautiful music, the most carefully cultivated fields, all of it is temporary, if all of it depends on the continued existence of the people who created it, the institutions that maintained it, and the traditions that remembered it. When any of these fail, the achievement begins to fade. When all of them fail, the achievement disappears entirely, leaving behind only the mute physical traces that archaeologists can recover if they know where to look. The PU knew where to dig their canals. They knew how to fire their bricks. They knew how to smelt their iron and cast their silver coins. They knew the sutras of the Buddha and the architecture of the stupa. They knew how to build cities that endured for centuries in one of the most challenging agricultural environments in Southeast Asia. And they knew, perhaps, that none of it would last forever, because the Buddhism they practiced teaches that impermanence is the fundamental condition of all things, that everything that arises must eventually pass away, that attachment to permanence is the root of suffering. Perhaps the PU would not have been surprised by their own forgetting. Perhaps they would have seen in it a confirmation of the Dharma they followed, the teaching that all conditioned things are impermanent. Perhaps they would have accepted their dissolution with the equanimity that their religion counselled, understanding that the passing of their civilization was no different, in kind, from the passing of a single human life, a brief gathering of conditions that inevitably disperses. The Buddhist teaching of impermanence, anicca, is not a counsel of despair, it is a counsel of realism. All things that arise must pass away. This is not a tragedy, it is a fact. The PU understood this fact, lived by it, built their monasteries and their stupas in full awareness of it. And perhaps there is a kind of wisdom in their acceptance, a wisdom that we, who build our monuments in steel and glass and believe they will last forever, have yet to learn. The Irrawaddy still flows, the monsoons still come and go, the dry zone still turns brown after the rains retreat and green when they return. The rhythms of the land have not changed, only the people have changed, and the names they use, and the stories they tell about who was here before them. The PRU are gone, but the land they shaped remains, subtly marked by their presence. The contours of their canals still faintly visible, the bricks of their stupas still scattered through the soil, the outlines of their city walls still traceable from satellite photographs taken from the edge of space. But we who are not yet ready to accept the impermanence of our own civilization may find it harder to be so calm. The PU built cities larger than Rome. They practiced a faith that is still alive in the hearts of hundreds of millions of people. They engineered landscapes that fed generations, and they are gone, not destroyed, not conquered, just gone, dissolved into the soil and the silence and the slow turning of centuries. The brick stumps of the Borbagi stupa stand in the afternoon light. They ask no questions. They make no claims. They are simply there, the last visible remnant of a civilization that lasted 1,000 years and then whispered its way into oblivion. The question is not rhetorical, it is genuine, and it demands an answer, because the answer determines what kind of relationship we choose to have with the past. If only the remembered civilizations matter, then the past is a curated gallery, a selection of highlights chosen by the curators of historical memory. If all civilizations matter, even the forgotten ones, then the past is a vast, largely uncharted landscape that we have barely begun to explore. The PU invite us to choose the second option, to recognize that the human story is far larger, far more diverse, and far more surprising than the stories we have chosen to tell about it. If a civilization lasts 1,000 years and no one remembers it, did it matter? The bricks say yes. The silence says nothing at all. But perhaps one day the silence will be broken. Perhaps archaeologists will uncover the archives, if they exist, the records carved in stone or pressed into clay that tell the PU story in their own words. Perhaps linguists will complete the decipherment of the PU language and give voice to the inscriptions that still stand, mute and patient, in the dry zone of Myanmar. Perhaps the world will learn to listen to the bricks, to hear in their mute persistence the echo of a civilization that lasted 1,000 years and asked for nothing except to be remembered.